we have a follow-up on this. I guess it's 2 weeks from now, and we generally do a deeper dive. So if you heard something you liked and you want a little more, please sign up for that one. Uh, this is just some brief housekeeping up front. These are more education discussions, and hopefully you get value out of that. This is not, my obligatory disclaimer. This is not investment advice. Examples or things that you hear about here are just that. They're examples, and for education purposes, we don't promote, get paid by uh, anybody. So, again, strictly for educational purposes. I like questions. I like the give and take of that. So if you have a question, you can either, you know, uh, depending on how many people are on the call right now, we're not terribly many. So you could just blurt it out. Maybe the better thing to do is to write it in the chat. Siobhan will monitor the chat, and we'll make sure we answer all those questions. And um, today's topic is really about creating your investor playbook. These are things or general observations that I've seen over years from successful users of self-directed accounts. There's I think it it successful people generally are doing the same sorts of things or following the same sort of guidelines, let's say, and that's really what I want to give you guys tonight. What is that sort of that practical framework, if you will, or guideposts or things that you should maybe think about. So for those of you who are new to self-direction, I'm just going to spend a brief moment here and talk about what self-direction is. So in retirement plans, self-direction simply means that you have the ability to choose your investments. You're not limited to stocks and bonds. Uh, Although many people come to listen to us, and they think that again you're constrained by stocks and bonds, and that's something that I think TV and advertising has put out there. But there's a much broader spectrum of investments, and generally there's really only two things that you cannot invest in. One is life insurance, and the other is collectibles. So everything else is fair game. And most of our clients are investing in things that they invest in anyway, or the things that they're interested in. So, there's, as many of you know, there are other rules with respect to who the account can transact business with. I'm not going to get into that right now. We can certainly get into that if you want later on. But the focus of this is to really talk about those commonalities or those things that we see that make people successful users of self-direction. And the other thing I'm going to throw out there too is, although these are retirement plans and they're called retirement plans, I'd like you to really think of them in terms of tax advantaged accounts. And the reason I say that is that, the people's concept of retirement, quite frankly, has changed over time. So one of the things that we see here is people that utilize self-directed accounts tend to be entrepreneurial in nature. They tend to own their own businesses. They have a lot of varied interests. So although they might have a day job as an engineer, for instance, maybe they're investing in real estate on the side, or as my kids would say, that's their side hustle kind of thing. So they're very active people, and they're um, sort of swim against the grain. And by that I mean they're not sitting at home watching TV and just consuming. They're actually out there learning and doing. And I think that that's one of the big differences. The you know investors that have the smoothest experience tend to invest in things that they know about. So, for instance, if you like real estate or you're in the business of real estate in their self-directed accounts, you tend to invest in real estate. And even to be a little more specific about that, if you like rental property, then generally we'll see rental property held within the account. If you like to lend money, then they tend to be lenders. If you're a hard money guy, it tends to be hard money. If you're softer or what I would call private money, it tends to be that as well. So really what people are doing is they're investing in things that they know about, but they're doing it in a tax deferred or maybe tax free if it's Roth environment as opposed to just a taxable environment. And really where that becomes important is that if you think about this, and this is sort of my 30,000 foot view of tax, and I'm sure some of you guys have heard me say this before, you know, income really falls into three buckets. It's either taxable, tax deferred, or tax free. So taxable is everything that you do during your life. So if you, for instance, own a piece of property and you buy it for 100,000, you sell it for $225,000, you got $125,000 gain, you pay tax on that, right? In a taxable environment. If you do that in a tax deferred environment, you wouldn't pay tax on it until you actually pull it out. If you do it in a tax free, obviously it's tax free. Some of the other things that fall into these other buckets, so tax deferred would include annuities, okay? Tax free might include municipal bonds, for instance, although the rate of return is already baked in because they're discounted or they give you a smaller return on investment because they've already factored in the tax-free treatment. The other one is probably life insurance, but if you're on the receiving end of that, then somebody else has done you a favor and passed away. So but again, you have sort of those three general buckets, if you will. And the idea is how do you jump from bucket to bucket to bucket efficiently? And one of the things that I always say to people is in a perfect world, if you could do all of your activities in either a tax deferred or a tax free environment, what that would obviously it's not practical, but what would be the result of that? And the result would generally be instead of being taxed on production, in other words, everything that you earn, you'd be paying tax on consumption, which is only what you spend. Okay, or if it's tax free, not at all, because you've effectively prepaid your tax. So again, what I want you to do or sort of begin to think about is thinking of these as tax deferred or tax advantaged accounts as opposed to retirement accounts, because the reality is most of you who are entrepreneurial in nature or self-employed are not going to retire at an anointed retirement age. And again, I'll go back to my real estate investors. If you are 65 years old and somebody comes up to you and says, "Hey, sell my house," you're not going to sit there and say, "I can't do that because I'm 65," right? You're gonna you're gonna grab it and you're gonna sell it and get the commission. And really what you're going to find as time goes on, and this is true, and this has been a bit of a sea change over the last maybe 20 years, is that people are not, retirement is not I stop doing everything work related right now and then I go golf or hunt or do whatever your hobby is. Okay. Most people cut back or they work on their terms as opposed to somebody else's terms. And what I'm finding more and more, even if you work for a big company, is they are very likely to hire you on a consultant basis because it is cheaper to keep you on and pay you for what you do, okay, on a limited basis, as opposed to train somebody else. And by the way, pay all the benefits attendant to that as well. So, there's been a bit of a sea change over the last, 10, 20 years. And again, most of the people that I know who are either entrepreneurial in nature or self-employed don't tend to retire or they just cut back. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense. Um, and again, what we see is people do in their plans the same thing that they do outside their plans. So you're leveraging your knowledge, right? You've already got those contacts, and I'll use real estate as an example. Yeah, generally in real estate, I can tell you personally with real estate that I buy, when I can, I use my team. I use the same inspectors. I use the same settlement company. I use the same, because I'm familiar with all those people. And in a tax deferred environment or tax free if it's Roth, I can do the same thing. I can use my team. There are some limitations if they're family members or what have you, but generally, I am leveraging my contacts. I'm leveraging what I've already learned. I don't have to learn something completely new, which is good. Most people as they transition or they think about a plan, the most effective people with self-direction are people that think beyond a year or 3 years. Okay, really, they're out 5 years or longer. And if you think about that, that sort of tracks with entrepreneurs and with people who are self-employed because, if I'm going to pick on the people who have a day job, right? You're you get paid to do something, okay? And it's generally uh, today, tomorrow, you might be tasked to look into the future. If you're a manager, it might be, a certain distance out, but you're not thinking much beyond whatever the horizon is that somebody else has set out there for you. If you're self-employed, you got to think really long term. You got to think past tomorrow. You got to think about 5 years from now. If you've got young children, you're thinking about the point that that they go to school, and how are you going to fill up that, the cup, so to speak. No, so you're thinking longer term, and people who utilize the self-directed accounts the most effectively are thinking, you know, 5, 10 years out. Any questions so far? Anybody got any comments about what I've said? Thoughts? Come on, John, you got to have a thought. I can't hear you. John's going to have to get his mic working there. So,
I think, Mike, do you have a question? You look like you're unmuted.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
you're good.
All right. So as mine set up as a traditional IRA at 59 and a half, when you could start taking disbursements, can I make personal use of properties at that point?
Well, if you make personal use of property, then the property becomes distributable to you. Okay. So you don't necessarily want to do that, but clearly you can utilize the income and those sorts of things. And again, I go back to my analogy about, being taxed on consumption versus production. And usually an example I'll use is if I'll go back to the property that I set up in the beginning. If I sell that property at 225, I bought it at 100 and I got $125,000 gain. If I'm doing that in a taxable environment, I've got I've got two options. Okay, one or three options. One is I can pay the tax. The second is I can exchange it into another property, but that from a tax standpoint, that helps me to a point. but it doesn't really help me from a cash flow standpoint because I can't use any of that money for anything other than put it in the next property. Because if I do, then it becomes taxable. Okay. And then the other is that I'm kicking the can down the road in that at some point I'm going to have to pay the tax. And when I do an exchange, I don't get a step up in basis unless I put more money into property number two. And I just continue, if you will, to depreciate and continue on with property number one. Okay. And one of the things that we noticed, quite honestly, in my tax practice over the last couple of years, especially with rising the way property values were rising, it actually made sense for a number of people to go ahead and pay the tax now, okay, invest in new property and get a step up in basis, okay, and larger depreciation deductions and those sorts of things. But ultimately, you're paying tax on everything that you earn. If you do that in a tax deferred environment, so if you did, you bought that property at 100 and you sold it at 225, you got that 125 gain. If you need $20,000 to live, you pull the $20,000 out. Granted, you'll pay tax on 20, but you leave, in my example, the 105,000 in to build up or to continue to work for you in some fashion. The other thing is that you don't have to worry about time constraints, meaning that when you do an exchange, you've got 180 days from settlement to do something with the funds. And a year ago or 2 years ago, it was a little dicier because it was a seller's market. So it wasn't unusual that people were being outbid. So you might put a bid on a property and you get outbid and that time, that clock is ticking. The other challenge with 1031 exchanges is that you can only select up to 5 properties. So if you get outbid 4, 5 times, if you get outbid 5 times, you're done. You can't, you can't, you can't go a sixth round. Okay. So in self-directed accounts or in tax deferred environments, you don't have to worry about time frames or any of those sorts of things. You can sit and wait for your property to come along. Secondarily, most of us as real estate investors, we have a niche. I know I do. I like a certain kind of property. Uh, and if I do a 1031 exchange, I might get out of the niche, meaning that, especially as the prices are rising. So if in order to do an exchange, I have to buy something of equal or greater value than what I sold. So if my niche is townhouses that are between 200 and $300,000, okay, and I sell at 400,000, I've got to invest more than $400,000 in something, and that is probably out of my niche. Okay. Um, you know, Secondarily, maybe it doesn't cash flow or the ROI is not quite as good on that as it should be. So the nice part about doing it in a tax deferred environment, especially if you're over that 59 and a half, is you can pick and choose how much to take out without penalty, right? And then once you get to 73, then you have to start to draw out money, and we can talk about what strategies around that as well. Any That answer your question?
I think it does. I could, if I chose to, make use of the property, but I'd have to pull out the whole property.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and earlier you mentioned the hard money lending. Early on, I did the non-recourse loans. Is that still available? I thought that wasn't
Yeah.
allowed anymore.
No, you can. It's the only way. So what Mike is talking about is some people in who buy property in retirement accounts leverage, just as we do personally, right? But when you borrow or when a retirement plan borrows, it has to be a specific type of borrowing, and that is referred to as non-recourse. And what that means is that the beneficial owner of the account or a group of people referred to as disqualified persons cannot guarantee the loan. So the lender can only look to the property for repayment. So that's the non-recourse component of that. That's the only way that works. If you personally guarantee it, then you blow it up.
All right. That's
Okay.
it. Thank you.
You bet.
Hey, Jack, can I
Anybody
chime
else
in?
have a question? Yep, fire away.
So I did a 1031 exchange. I bought a house in Springfield, Virginia I bought it actually on a contract for deed, held on to it for, 20 years, 15 years, whatever it was, sold it, bought it for like about 250, sold it for 450. But then I had a capital gains problem. And so what I did is a 1031 exchange and I split it into two properties. I think both properties were the neighborhood of $250,000. But when you talk about that timing issue, oh my gosh, doing it with one property is crazy. Doing it with two, forget it. And what I've discovered is that it's so much easier when you're doing it within a self-directed account. You don't have any time constraints. You can just let the money sit there. When the right property comes by, you pounce on it. When you sell it, you don't have to worry about 1031 exchanges or time limits or anything else. It is so much more relaxed. The only constraint that I have found is that, and your son suggested I get you to go off on a rabbit trail on this. The only constraint that I have found is, no, he knows your vulnerable side. The contribution limitations. And he asked me to ask you about the Uber Roth contribution, which is a way of overcoming that. But apart from that, just being able to do stuff within a Roth IRA or a Roth 401k is so freeing. It's amazing.
Yeah. The other thing that people run into, and I didn't, for most of us, not only do we have a niche type of property, but also there's an area where you want to invest. So, if you're, I'm in Central Maryland, I'm Frederick County, Maryland, and quite frankly, when things were running, I like to invest in things that are around me. I'm not, I don't have the bandwidth to invest in property that's several hundred miles away. That's just that's just not my style. Okay. But there was not there wasn't a lot of property for sale here, number one. And it was, you were outbid almost immediately. I mean, it was, in fact, it didn't even, most of the time it didn't even hit the MLS. So you were bidding against people who were seasoned real estate people as well. So, that's it's a tough group, but anyway, that's the beauty of retirement plans is you're right. You don't have those time constraints and generally speaking, the gain is still, it's still tax deferred, which is what you get with that 1031 exchange. Um, you know, the the other thing that I see is that generally people who are using self-directed accounts they have their guardrails that they work within, and they're not people that are generally living in the moment, uh, or they're it is a process that you have to you can't fly by the seat of your pants. You have to go into or look at an investment with forethought. So, you can do, and many of you have heard me say this, you can do probably about 90% of what you want to do, okay, as long as you're thinking up front about it. You can't, one of the, I'll give you an example. One of the common um, issues that we see is somebody comes to us and they say, I got a property under contract and I want to open an account. say, well, that's great. Okay, so tell me about the contract. And they'll say, well, it's in the name of Jack, Jack and or assigns. I can't assign a contract to my retirement plan. Okay. So I've got to get that contract rewritten because a retirement plan has to be a party to the contract in the beginning. So that's what I mean by you have to have a little bit of forethought, and there's a little bit of planning that goes in place. And the people who are successful utilizing self-directed accounts understand the rules. Okay. And again, they tend to be a little more in the planning process than not. The other thing that comes up from time to time, and John touched on this a little bit, is the transference process. So if you've got money in other accounts and you're bringing it in, you have to recognize that, although in a lot of areas we live in the world of instant gratification, in the world of retirement plans, that's not the case. Every custodian has its own paperwork and quite frankly, the compliance rules that have to be satisfied. So it does take a little bit of time. Sometimes transferring funds takes a couple of weeks, or 3 weeks. So it's you gotta, again, I'm back to forethought. Um, Usually when I'm listening to people, uh, they're I can tell whether they're going to be successful or not just by their language that they use. So terms like I think or maybe, those sort of um, qualifiers are signs, at least to me, that maybe it hasn't been thought out as well as it should. Uh, you know, People who utilize these accounts well are clear-minded about what they're doing. So their language tends to be more along the lines of I know, I want, I need kind of thing, as opposed to maybe this, maybe that. So and I think again, I think in the entrepreneurial world, you'll see that too, because just if you're a business owner or entrepreneurial in nature, you tend to be thinking here and here, not here. Okay, so I think that comes through. Um, the yeah, it is usually people who are trying new things. They start small. So if you want to be successful and you are either new, and I'll pick on real estate again, um, new to real estate, or you've only bought one or two pieces of real estate, simple, right? Don't don't do a complicated deal in a retirement plan if you haven't done one before. Okay, do that personally. Okay, because what you're doing is you're doing something complicated in a structure which maybe you're not familiar with. So you're overcomplicating things, right? So stick with what you know, or our clients, and those are the clients that are on the call will attest to this. If you've got questions, call us. A lot of other providers aren't going to talk to you or aren't willing to talk about what you're trying to accomplish. When you're on the sales side of things, before you get in the door, they're more than happy to talk vast platitudes with you. But once your account is there, then that kind of dries up, and they don't want to talk to you until you have all the paperwork, or you submit all the paperwork to them to complete the transaction. The challenge is, particularly with real estate and lending and a lot of other alternative investments, so the paperwork's complicated, and sometimes the terminology is complicated. So, staying with real estate, people in real estate will talk about the HUD. Okay. We all know, and in fact, I don't think they call it that anymore. Now I'm showing my age, but if you're in real estate, you know what I'm talking about. If you are not in real estate, you're not familiar with that term. Okay. So every investment has its own vernacular and its own terms, and for instance, lending. When you buy a note in the open market, they talk about the UPB, the unpaid balance. Okay. And if you don't know what that is or what that means, you're going to be lost. And every investment has its own set of terminology, and that's what makes sometimes that's what makes the custodian's job or our job a little different or harder is because we have to know how this kind of transaction works and this transaction and this transaction and there's people doing a lot of different things. So our view is communication is key, and we want to know when you're beginning the transaction as opposed to when you're halfway down the pike on it. Or quite frankly, what happens a lot of times, and I hear these horror stories all the time, is that people submit the paperwork and they think they have all the paperwork together and they don't. They're missing something. And I will, for instance, in a lot of large, what I call syndicated deals, which are large um, partnerships or LLCs that are they might be note pools or they might be rental pools or they might be hedge funds or those sorts of things. There's a set of paperwork there that deals with what's called an accredited investor. And there's a number of times where people have submitted paperwork to us. And I say, well, where's the accredited investor paperwork? They don't know what we're talking about. Okay. You have to remember that who has ever put that deal together is more concerned about getting your funds out of your pocket and into their investment as opposed to whether things are I's are dotted and T's are crossed. Now, that's not a great example because those guys have a lot of compliance issues too, but that's an example of, they're not always entirely helpful as to what the paperwork is. Okay.
Hey, Jack, can I chime in on something?
Yeah.
One of the things
Yeah.
and you've mentioned this before in previous webinars, that realtors tend not to be, real estate people tend not to be super detailed people. So it's counterintuitively managing that free spirit. And so what I did is, I'm doing a deal right now. Acquisition cost is 170. The ARV on it is 270. And so you might think, well, that's a lot of meat on those bones, And so and the rehab on it's 45,000. So I thought I'm going to make 50K, well, maybe not. And so I went through the discipline of creating a spreadsheet where I input, the acquisition costs, the closing costs, the rehab costs, and I put in a 20% fudge factor, a contingency factor, because I know. The guy didn't have anything in his scope of work for, an HVAC system. I know that's $6,500. I know I'm going to buy an HVAC system, but he didn't have it in there. I don't know if it's because he wanted his numbers to look good to me or something, but when you go through that discipline of tying down every single number that you can possibly think of, what are the back end costs, your closing costs? You might have to give the buyer as much as a 3% buyer's closing cost credit. You're going to have realtors fees on the back end. You're going to have closing costs on the back end, prorations, things like that. If you can try to tie those things down, you don't have to tie them down to the penny. You can kind of get a reasonable estimate of what that's going to be, but you're not blindsided by well, what do you mean? I thought I was going to make 50K in this deal. What do you mean I'm making 10 or 5? Or what do you mean I got to bring money to the table? So that's been helpful to me.
Yeah. It goes, the challenge, and you'll hear this adage in real estate particularly, mistakes are expensive. Okay. We're not, you buy a real estate asset, it's not for 10 or 20 or 30,000. It's, 100, 150, 200 plus. So those mistakes tend to be costly, which is also one of the things that you'll find with people. One reason people are successful in with self-direction, generally, when you look at what they're investing in, they're successful for two reasons. First of all, they know what it is they're investing in, and because they like what they're doing, they tend to be a little more on top of things. You know, in a common trading account, and there's a place. I'm going to preface this by saying there's a place for stocks and bonds, okay? But it is there. There are very, very few people that really understand the market. Typically, what they're doing is you're giving your money to a broker or a financial planner or somebody to to invest it for you. And if you look at most of those investments, they either rise and fall with the general market. Okay? You might do a little better if you're lucky, or not so bad as the market drops, as the market drop is, and that would be good. But it is rare unless you have a lot of money that you put money with an investment advisor that is buying, marketable securities in the stock market, and they're doing significantly better than the market does. Unless maybe you're in Congress, maybe that's the only other way to do that. But
Yeah.
but but
I
you know,
heard
but
Ilhan
that's
Omar is worth 40 million. How does that happen?
God bless her, man. God bless her. You know, but if you're in self-direction or you're investing in property, generally, again, you're a little more activist. You're using your own team, you're watching the investment, and you are plugged in to what's going on. So I mean, you're managing the asset as opposed to leaving that or ceding that to somebody else. So if there's an issue that's coming up, you generally see that either as it occurs or before it occurs, as opposed to somebody telling you a couple of months later, gee, we had a bad quarter. Okay. Um, so, again, there's a place for diversification. There's a place for stocks and bonds but generally people, if you stick with what you know, you're going to be much better off. Okay. Um, in self-directed world, there are some challenges to unique challenges to executing documents and those sorts of things. One of the things that we talk about, particularly on our client calls, is how to deal with that. Generally, we all have the same sort of issues, and I'll give you a very simple example. That I was talking to somebody today who is, they have to pay their utility bill every month. Okay, they're doing a rehab, and it's taken longer. And he says to me, he says, "Well, gee, I hate writing this $50 check to Vetco every month." And I said, "Well, why don't you pay $200? Okay, they'll work against that, so to speak. And if you sell it, you'll get it credited back. It'll come back to you. So it's not as if you're losing the money, but sometimes it's simple little things like that are helpful. Okay, but it can be, obviously, each type of investment poses its unique set of challenges, and collectively between you and us, we have to work through that. And that's part of the function of these calls. This is, that's where education really makes the difference. And knowing your investments helps to make that whole process smoother. And again, you're a little more proactive in in what you're looking at and what you're doing. So, does anybody have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, John. So I get that $100 power bill every month, I can request, despite what the bill says, I can say, pay them $500.
Yep, you bet.
I didn't know that. Okay.
Yep. Yeah.
That's a good
Yeah.
idea.
And
Yeah.
on going back to the non-recourse loans, if I know somebody wants to buy a boat, it has to be real estate, something it can be anything.
All right, so let me ask you a question. Are you talking about lending or are you talking about borrowing?
I'm talking about, I know somebody that needs money to purchase whatever.
Okay. All right. So if the account is the lender, okay, it does not have to be non-recourse. So let's say for the sake of discussion that you are going to lend Tim. Okay, Tim wants to buy a boat. We'll use your example. Okay, Tim wants to buy a boat, and he's going to buy a nice boat. Okay, because I know Tim doesn't want a piece of garbage. It's got to have a bathroom in there. It's got to have a place to shower. It's got to have a berth in it that's long enough, that he can actually stretch out. So
Kind of like a
he
425.
needs so you know, he needs $100,000, and even then, that probably only buys him half the boat. Okay, but you can negotiate whatever terms that you want with Tim. Okay, because Tim is the debtor, not the account. Okay, so as you're haggling back and forth, the only thing that the account, or as the account, and what we're looking at, let's put it that way. Okay, you don't want an interest rate that's too low because that could be construed to be a gift. Okay, and you can't have one that's too high because that's usurious. And depending on state, so if we're talking about usurious, each state has a different threshold of what usury is. So you're looking at the threshold in the state where the debtor is, not where you are, okay, where the debtor is. All right. The other thing that you have to be a little careful of is, and this is true of real estate more than anything else. If it's me, I only want to lend on investment property. Okay. I don't want to lend to somebody who's going to use the house as their personal residence because then you get into consumer protection issues. So I think, for instance, in Maryland, I believe that if you have one loan to a principal resident, that makes you subject to all the consumer protection stuff in Maryland. Okay. In Virginia, I think I'm going to say three, but it might be five. Okay. So I just kind of steer clear of that. So I'm lending to investors or people who are using those funds to invest in or to buy investment property. Now I can have a personal guarantee of the debtor. I certainly want a security interest on the property. So whether it's that boat that Tim's buying or a piece of property, it's I can certainly do that. Uh, so, but the point to this is that is all up to, that's between you and the debtor. Okay. Now, non-recourse, really where that comes into play is when the account is borrowing money. Okay, so let me step back for a minute. I talked about the one set of rules with self-direction deals with what an account can buy or invest in. Two things you can't do. One is collectibles, so think fine wines, works of art, anything that has that collectible nature to it. And the other, in most retirement plans, is life insurance. Okay, there's a very small subset, but generally those aren't accounts that are self-directed. So I couldn't, for instance, in my retirement plan, I couldn't buy a life insurance policy on me or a family member. Okay, and part of the challenge is, when you buy an insurance policy, a life policy, for instance, you have to have an insurable interest, right? So if I get an insurance policy and I make my wife the beneficiary, she has an insurable interest because we're married. I can't go out, for instance, and get an insurance policy on you because I don't have an insurable interest. And quite frankly, if the government allowed us to do that, there'd be a lot of, contracts of another sort out there, right? So that's, generally speaking, that's not allowed. And if I buy a policy in my account and I make my wife the beneficiary, that's prohibited because she's part of the other part of the rules, which deals with disqualified persons. Disqualified persons are people and entities that cannot transact business with the retirement account. Okay. Now, transact business is any financial interaction. So buy, sell, lend, lease, borrow. Okay. And then a couple of other things. So use, which is something we talked about. Okay. Or guarantee. So if I personally guarantee a loan that my retirement plan took out, I'm giving the retirement plan the benefit of my financial backing. Okay. And the retirement plan has to stand on its own. Because so when you're thinking about the retirement plan, it is a person separate and apart or an entity separate and apart from you. Okay. So disqualified persons fall into three groups. First is family members. So if you reach out there in space and you put, and you put a dot out there and that dot is you, okay, and you draw a vertical line through that dot. Anybody that's on the vertical line is disqualified. Okay. So here's our graphic. All right. So your ascendants, descendants, spouses. Okay. And the thinking here, as far as the government's concerned, is they don't want to get into trying to figure out what the true sales price of something is. So if Bob and if I sell something to Bob, there's an adversarial relationship there, right? Because Bob is trying to get the best deal he can get. I'm trying to get the most money I can get. So we're going to come to the middle somewhere. Okay. If I'm selling it or I'm buying a piece of property from my father, is that really going to be an arm's length transaction? Maybe, maybe not. The other thing the government's concerned about is shifting assets from taxable environments to tax deferred environments, generation skipping. They want their pound of flesh. Okay. And they don't want to have to look through a lot of gobbledygook to figure out what it is. Okay. So that first group is family members. The second group is people that work on the account. So if you own an asset in the account, I can't buy it from the account because I work for you. I work for the account. Okay, we're too close. And then the third, which we run into from time to time, is certain other relationships. And the best way to talk about this is really by example. So if John and I are partners in an entity, maybe we're partners, we're both invested in an apartment complex. If he's an 8% investor and I'm a 6% investor, we're not disqualified with respect to each other because we don't control the entity. We're just invested in the same thing. Okay. But if John owns 35% and I own 25%, now we can control it, right? Because we're over 50%. So we can dictate policy, and part of that gets into what's the value of it. If John and I are invested in something that's $100, I don't think that's a big issue. But if we're invested in something that's $1 million, that's a horse of a different color. Okay. So in keeping this as the backdrop, when an IRA or a retirement plan by definition is a trust. Okay. So a trust can borrow money, but it has to be non-recourse because if it's not, and the person that's guaranteeing the loan is one of these disqualified persons, then that basically blows up the account. That becomes a prohibited transaction. Okay. So it has to be non-recourse, which means the lender can only look to the property or to the collateral for repayment. So if it was the boat, for instance, if I had a boat in in my retirement account and I borrowed money, okay, then I can't personally guarantee it. Okay. So that non-recourse does not extend. That's only if if the retirement plan is on the debtor side, not on the lending side. Does that make sense? Okay.
Hey, Jack, if I could pipe in for a quick second, I like that idea about your boat. I'm going to put some serious thought to that. But my
Don't forget
question,
your buddies.
yeah, exactly. Hey, so my question is, if I have an LLC in my retirement plan owns the LLC, and my son owns his own LLC, it's just his regular money. It's not his retirement account. I could buy a piece of property, 80%, say if I buy 75% of it, it goes into my LLC and 25 into his. He comes up with his own money, I come up with my own money. We can invest in the same project together as long as we don't commingle, right? As long as he pays his 25% share and he'll get 25% of the gain, correct?
Yeah. So this is, this is a good example of something that we would normally talk about at our clients only. But since most of us are clients and we're all friends here, right? We'll talk about this. So ordinarily, what Tim is talking about, okay, let's not complicate it. Let's just say for the sake of discussion that your son and your retirement plan are going to invest in a piece of property. Okay. All right. Directly. Now, on its face, I just went through this 5-minute dissertation about disqualified persons and all those things. And most people who are not familiar with self-direction would say, well, that sounds like a prohibited transaction. And the reason it's not is exactly what Tim said in towards the end of that example, which is they're investing at the same thing at the same time. So nobody is buying something from somebody else. They're merely putting money side by side in the same investment. So it was a piece of real estate and you were doing it directly, not with LLCs. That would be basically it would look like a tenants in common. So it would be an undivided interest. Okay, you and your son. And quite frankly, even if you're doing it within LLCs or what have you, I'd probably still do undivided interest. Okay. So one thing that you have to be careful of or think about here is down the line. Okay. So when disqualified persons invest in the same thing with each other, they need to stay in proportion with the initial investment. So first of all, percentage of ownership is driven by money in the deal. So I'll use Siobhan as an example, since most of you know that Siobhan and I are related, even though she might not admit that all the time. But so if I'm using retirement plan money and Siobhan is using personal money, and we're buying $100,000 piece of property, and I'm putting in 75% and she's putting in 25%. I'm using retirement plan money, she's not. Because we're disqualified, we must always remain 75% my retirement account, 25% to Siobhan. Okay. So the easiest way to do this is to set up an entity, right? So if it's a rental property, rents are going to go into the entity, expenses are going to be paid out of the entity. And when we take distributions, it has to be 75-25. It can't be anything other than that. And it has to be at the same time. Okay. If we need more money, it's got to be 75%. If we need another $10,000 to put a roof on the property, 7,500 has to come from me, 2,500 from Siobhan. Okay. Because for instance, if she fronts the money, okay, now she is giving my retirement plan a benefit of her financial wherewithal. and that's prohibited. Okay. So that's why it always has to stay in phase. So if we bring, let's say for the sake of discussion, we need more money. So we had a renter in there, they trashed the place. We need $50,000. Neither one of us can stomach putting more money in. And John comes along. And John just so happens to have $50,000. And he wants to invest in this piece of property because he loves this piece of property down in downtown, the bowels of Baltimore. Okay. So he's going to come in with his 50. Okay. Now, he does not have to be in proportion to anything because he is not disqualified. So if he comes in and he says, I really like you guys, but I don't like you that much. And in order to pull you guys out of the fire, I want 50%. Okay. And Siobhan and I look at each other and we go, okay, we'll do that. So John is now a 50% owner, and I've got to drop to 37.5, and Siobhan has to drop to 12.5. Okay. Because the 37.5 to the 12.5 is 75.25. Okay. So we have to stay in phase. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Because if we don't, then we got a problem. Okay. So when you are, when you're partnering, and again, this sort of goes back to the discussion about planning and what successful people who utilize these tax deferred accounts do is they're thinking ahead. Because the other thing that you have to think about, or in my example that I need to think about, is generally speaking, the retirement plan has a finite amount of money in it, right? I mean, I can go out and borrow, but it's non-recourse. It's a little harder for a retirement plan to borrow money than it is as an individual. Okay. So you want to think about what that's going to look like and plan for contingencies. And this is kind of what John was talking about when he was talking about his checklist or his formula that he has, and he sits there and he pads it for contingencies, 10%, 20%, whatever that is. And the reason is because he knows that the retirement plan, although it's got a significant amount of money and it's finite. At some point, it stops. It can't go borrow from the bank of mom and dad. It can't go, all those sorts of things, you know. So a little bit of forethought and a little bit of planning goes a long way. Does that make sense to everybody?
Hey, Jack.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my question about this non-recourse. So I flip houses and I'm actually doing one in Newmarket now, but say I ran across a good deal. I want to do it inside my IRA, my self-directed IRA. And,
Mhm.
going out and trying to borrow money I found out that these non-recourse loans, they're expensive. They want a lot, they want you to put a ton of skin in the game, right? Because the only recourse they have is against the property, like you say. So to avoid having to go to a lender and borrow money for a house that I want to purchase inside my IRA, can I just use private lenders that I've always used before?
You can use anybody can lend the retirement plan money, you know, with two exceptions. Okay. One is they can't be a disqualified person. So you go back to that graphic that Siobhan had, and she's more than happy to send it to you if you want it. But if your private lender is not a disqualified person, then yeah, you can go borrow from that person or that entity to your heart's content, so long as it's non-recourse.
Hey, Jack, can I interject something?
Sure.
There's a lender that I ran into who claims to be a non-recourse private lender, and his rates are similar to normal 5% down conventional rates or 20% down conventional Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac underwritten rates. And I was stunned. I mean, he's not looking for 12% or 13%. He is a little heavy on points. He wants 2 points up front, but it sounded pretty attractive. One thing he insists on is that the property be in an LLC. And I went, oh, I know why, because you're going to ask me for a personal guarantee on the back end. And I think I sent his name over to you and all like that, but I think it'd be worth it for you and he to have a conversation, or maybe just look at his loan docs before somebody gets too far downstream with this guy. But it sounded attractive to me. And I've elected to do everything for cash, just because I don't want to share. You know? But that could be a useful tool for somebody who wants to use a lender, if that guy is in fact a non-recourse lender.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to interject too, if I could, is I always, and I had this save my bacon in more than one situation. I always get the insurance from the utility company on the utility lines from the house up to the street, and I also get the same coverage from my my insurance company. And most of the time, I rarely need it, but you don't know what kind of shape those pipes are, especially on a flip. You buy a foreclosure property, you don't know what you're buying. And and they have a 30-day waiting period too, which might complicate things a little bit. So it's most helpful on rentals. But on this flip that I'm doing, I told the guy, we're not going to run any water down those pipes for 30 days. And after the water and see what we got, with respect to plumbing and all that kind of stuff. But I had one house that saved me $20,000 to have that insurance in place, and it's like $6 a month.
Yeah. Well, we're back to, again, we're back to forethought, we're back to planning, we're back to knowing your business. Okay. Quite frankly, I flip property, few and far between, and it's usually because I'm so bad at it. It's usually at the point that I've forgotten the last flip that I do the next one, and then that reminds me that this is not in my wheelhouse, but it is, for, again, I'm back to planning, I'm back to forethought, I'm back to knowing your business. And that's clearly that's where you're at. Steve, again, your borrower or your lender, I'm sorry, can be, the only parameters are it can't be a disqualified person, and it has to be non-recourse, and as long as it passes those two gates, you're good.
Okay, I appreciate it.
No problem. No problem. So, just as we sort of close this out here, I would encourage you to, John, I think John is actually on this path. Build your playbook, so to speak. Stay with what you know. Okay. You'll be better off. Plan it. Okay. If you need some help, or there's some things that you're unclear about, as you guys who are clients of ours know, you can always call us. We're more than happy to kick around scenarios or those sorts of things. And quite frankly, for us, it's helpful for two reasons. First of all, if we know ahead of time what you're doing, okay, if you can't do it or it's not going to work, it's much better to know up front than to have you get 3/4 of the way down the pipe and then find out you can't do it. It's a colossal, it's a waste of your time, energy, all those things. Okay. For us, it helps us because we know if we know that we've got closings, I say this all the time, but if I know that I've got 50 closings a week from Friday. They're all going to get done. Okay. We plan for it. We put them in the pipe. You know, there's always some things that come up at the last minute. Okay. But it's on the radar screen. Quite frankly, I don't know how other companies do it where you submit paperwork, you know, in a real estate deal, you know, again, I'll use real estate. Lending is this way too. A lot of times they don't have the lending documents until the day before, a couple of, you know, maybe 2 days before you've got to close. You know, there's, you know, in that world, if I don't know until today that I got 50 closings tomorrow, that's tough. Think about Monday, yesterday, at least for those of you who are in the, you know, in the Maryland, DC, Virginia area. You know, you guys know there was not, you know, although we were all working, right? But there was not a lot of other people out there in the DMV working. You know, everybody else was sleeping late or drinking coffee or doing whatever they do. Because in this area, when it snows or sleets or whatever, this place locks down. It amazes me. So, but we knew that snow was coming. You know, fortunately, it wasn't as bad as they said it was going to be. But everything that needed to close yesterday closed on Friday. Okay, and that for us, that's the advantage to knowing ahead of time. So, um,
That's a
anyway,
quick question.
Yeah.
Uh, Going back to prohibited transactions and investing in collectibles and things of that sort, let's talk about
Mm-hmm.
boats for a minute. I ran into somebody who actually, I love antique wooden boats. I just do. Not that I'm going to buy one because they're crazy maintenance, but I actually had somebody that had a 19, like a 19, what was it? 19, like 1950 Chris Craft for like $55,000. And I took an interest in what this couple was doing. And I said, "Oh, well, we flip boats." I go, "No joke." And they said, "Yeah, we flip them within our IRA and our 401k, our Roth IRA and our Roth 401k." I go, "No joke." So what would be the limitations on somebody who wants to flip something like a boat? We were talking about boats. Somebody wants to flip a boat. Somebody wants to flip like an antique car. Now, I guess when you start talking about antique cars, you're now getting into collectibles, right? Or no?
No, you are. So, you know, cars are a good example. So in, you know, every state has a registry of some sort of uh, antique cars. Okay. And, you know, I think in Maryland, and I'm not a car guy, so I could be wrong, but I think if a car is more than 20 years old, you can put it on the historic, you can get a historic plate and it ends up on the historic thing. You know, it ends up as an antique, which is synonymous to saying it's collectible. Okay. And I'll give you an example that I had years ago. There was a guy, and I can't remember exactly where this was, but the guy had a bought a car, and it was like a 1950 something Bentley. Okay. Ordinarily, and he kept it, you know, he had it stored and he paid a storage unit, and there, you know, I guess this thing was hermetically sealed. I don't, you know, again, I'm not a car guy, so I don't really know. All I know is it was a lot of money. Okay. And when we were looking into it, you know, my concern was 1955, you know, this is antique, right? Whatever state he was in, it was not on the registry. So the state had a collectible registry or an antique registry. So as long as it's not on that registry, you're okay. Right?
Really? So
So,
if you
yep.
picked up some
So
muscle
some
car
of
in a
this,
barn,
well, you know, and I'll, you know, and again, I'll go back to, you know, to this is again the theme of this, knowing your business. Okay. So, and I'll go to property. I'm in Frederick. I'm in the historic city of Frederick. Okay. If I go, I know that although the building that I'm in, right, this is an old building.
It's beautiful.
Okay. If I put it, if I register it, okay, and I put it on the historic registry, I will never be able to do another thing to the outside of this property as long as I own it. And neither will the next guy. Okay. So, before you get the little plaque on your house, right, you got to think long and hard about what that means to you. Okay. And for me, in the having an office and being able to change the inside as I want is a lot better than having a nice little plaque that says, you know, congratulations, you're on the registry. But I'm back to you need to understand your business, you need to know your business. So you go back to the Chris Craft. I would, I don't know as much about boats as you do, but I grew up on the Jersey Shore and spent a fair amount of time on boats. And a Chris Craft is a pretty sexy old ship. Okay.
Gorgeous.
And ordinarily, I would think of
Modern.
that as being, as being antique. Okay. And I would, if there's a registry, and I don't know this, if there's a registry for boats or there's a place where that would be registered, if it is, then it's probably a collectible. If it's not, then it's not. So a lot of these rules around the collectibles gets into what is the usual and customary thing in the asset that you're looking at. Okay.
Going back
Anybody
to the
else?
sailboat, I think somebody mentioned buying a boat. If you bought a boat inside your retirement account, it would be purely as an investment. You could not use it, correct?
Right. Right. So, and I know because I get emails from this place that, it's almost like an Airbnb for boats. You sign up, I think it's called Pinnacle Yachts. Okay. They have a registry, or they have 8, 10 different locations around the Maryland, Virginia, maybe even up into Delaware and New Jersey coastlines. And they have a number of yachts that you can rent for the day, week, however that works. But basically, you can't use it. Okay. The account has to pay for the maintenance and the upkeep and all of the things attendant to the asset, just like it has to do for any other asset. But yeah, it's permissible. Okay. Anybody else?
Also more like
Anything
a big
else?
tax loss that you do on the taxable side rather than when your tax-free account, because you want the depreciation.
Well, in a retire, in the tax deferred or tax free, depreciation doesn't matter, right? Because it's tax deferred. Okay, there's no reason for depreciation. So really, what you're looking at is what's the profit? Okay, so I'm a rental real estate guy. So in my retirement account, the properties that are in good areas, um, low maintenance, stable tenants, uh, I would tend to do those in my retirement account. Okay. Because they're low maintenance. Okay. The ones that are, I would never, there's certain areas that I wouldn't invest in anyway. But if I was looking at an area that was maybe on the decline, okay, the rents are sporadic. Uh, you know the I probably would do that personally because it's going to take a little bit of finesse, right? And if I run into a problem, look, nobody likes to lose money, but if I lose money, at least it's deductible. Okay. that's kind of thing. Where in a retirement plan, tax deferred environment, if you lose money, you just lose money. So, if you invest in the high flying stock today and it drops to zero tomorrow, you just lose in a retirement account.
Do you have any comments about mobile home investments?
Um, we have a number of clients that really like mobile homes. I'm personally, and this is just my personal feeling, I'm not a fan of anything that can move. Okay. So I like real estate because real estate is stays in one place. Okay. Um, Especially if because I do a fair amount of lending. Okay. So I would, I, I don't personally, I don't lend on mobile homes because again, first of all, they move. Second of all, they tend to, they're easy to damage, you know. Uh, I personally, it's not my investment of choice, but we have a number of people that do very well with them. And one of the things that I see a lot with mobile homes is lease option to buy. So, we've got one client in particular I think about. The going rent is maybe $400, I think. And she collects, her lease option to buy, she collects $500. So that extra 100 goes into escrow. Okay. And in 2 years, the tenant has an option to buy the property at a stated price. And I think she sets the price up front. I could be wrong about that, but I think that's done at the time of the lease. Okay. In all the time that I've known her, I have never known a tenant to take to buy the mobile home. So she ends up with an extra, $100 a month, 2,400, and it's non-refundable. So the $100 is just part, if the person decides not to buy, that she keeps that. Okay. So, she collects an extra $100 a month over and above what the prevailing rent is in her area. Okay. So it's more than one way to make a buck. We have any other questions there?
That is it for
Yeah,
the chat.
I have a
I'm
question.
sorry.
Hi.
Sure.
I have a question. I'm Ben Young. I came in a little late, so I'm not familiar with all of the protocol to ask questions, but I have a matured self-directed Roth IRA where I'm over 59 and a half, and I have held it for more than 5 years. I'm looking at checkbook control to do some wholesaling. What's your reaction to checkbook control in a wholesaling environment with residential properties?
I don't necessarily have any trouble with that. I'll say this. If you are, checkbook control, the allure to that is, or one of the things that I always, that you'll hear is that allows you to do things faster than maybe the custodian will allow you to do it, where the custodian wants to keep your money. Quite frankly, the custodian doesn't want to keep your money because, at least here, I can tell you, we don't make money until you do something. Okay, so we want you to buy things, sell things, and interact. The challenge when you have checkbook control is all the rules fall to you to know, all right, and to follow. So just because you have an LLC, and I thought we were talking about a scenario earlier, and I thought that there was going to go in a certain direction, and it didn't. And but basically, if you have a checkbook IRA or you have checkbook control, and you buy a piece of property, you are still not going to be able to personally guarantee the loan. Okay, but you gotta know those rules. Okay, because the custodian, because we're not seeing any of the paperwork, as far as we're concerned, the investment is in checkbook IRA, period. So the money goes in, and we will ask for a fair market value every year. You give us that, uh, but all the rules attendant to that are on you to know. Okay. So if you do something that is prohibited, um, you're gonna pay the price. In if you have, let's say it's just property. Okay. If you buy a piece of property from your father, and you do it directly, and we allow you to do that, your recourse when IRS says, hey, that was prohibited, is, well, those chuckleheads at Mid-Atlantic let me do that. They should not have let me do that. And the IRS will say, you know something, you're right, and they'll give you a pass. But if you got checkbook control, you're chief cook and bottle washer, and there's no recourse on that. The other thing that you'll hear is, well, these things don't get audited very often, and it's once in a blue moon. So who will know, right? Really, what I see, and you're right, that doesn't happen, okay, very often. In the retirement plan world, usually where these things blow up is it's in your business interactions. So it's the person who had the checkbook LLC that is rehabbing, and they don't pay a vendor. Okay. The vendor sues them. The lawyer says, well, this is a retirement plan. If we can prove that the person didn't do things correctly, okay, i.e. pierce the corporate veil, which isn't hard to do with retirement plans, then it's immediately distributable to you, and it's just part of your personal assets, and it's easy to reach for a debtor. The other challenge that you run into with wholesaling, okay, and I quite frankly I spar with people all the time on that. Okay, so if I have an IRA, and this it's not unusual. I see ads out there all the time where it'll say, where I'll go and I'll go to an event, and I'll listen to a guru say, open an IRA, put $5,000 in it, and wholesale. Okay. I would suggest that you cannot do that. Okay. Because if I enter into a contract, or the IRA enters into a contract to buy a $100,000 piece of property, and it only has $5,000 to its name, it can't get financing for that. Okay, so you've entered into a contract to purchase something fraudulently, because the IRA doesn't have the money to do it. And usually the pushback is, well, it can go out and borrow the money. There isn't anybody that's going to lend an IRA non-recourse, okay, on a $100,000 piece of property, which I don't even know where you could buy a property for $100,000, putting $5,000 down. Okay. There's not a lender in the world that's gonna enter into that deal. Okay. Now, if you've got retirement plan money that you can transfer in somewhere else, all right, I'll buy that. Okay. But generally speaking, that, if the model is open an account with $5,000 and run with it and wholesale to your heart's content, that's not a viable option. Secondarily, the other thing that you'll see from time to time is that wholesaling is a personal service. Okay. Everything that we've talked about, everything else is an investment, right? I'm buying real estate. I'm making a loan. I'm buying a boat. All of those are investments. Wholesaling is really a personal service. And a retirement plan can't provide a personal service because it's not a person. Okay. So somehow you have to navigate that. And that tends to be, a finer point, but that can be problematic. Okay.
When you say problematic, is that according to the code, IRS code, or is that a gray area, or what is that?
No, it's not a gray area. So retirement plans, if you look at deeply into retirement plans make investments in things. Okay. So they, again, property, they're making loans, they're buying boats, they're buying, alpaca, they're making investments. The wholesaling is not an investment. Okay. It's a business, quite frankly. Okay. Now, retirement plans can invest in businesses. That's not a problem. But if the beneficial owner of the account is working in the business, then that can be prohibited. Okay. And the one who's providing that service presumably is you. Okay. So you're providing, you're providing the service, if you will, or you're providing the work, you're doing the work in that entity, which is problematic. And I'll go back to the rehabber, okay? Yeah, to Steve. Okay. Steve's doing rehabs in his retirement plan. He has to hire people to do the work. He can't swing a hammer. Okay. He has to hire people to swing hammers. He can manage it. Okay. But he can't swing a hammer because if he swings that hammer, he's providing value. Okay. And the only way you can provide value to a retirement plan is vis-a-vis contributions in cash. Okay. So, those are when you talk about wholesaling, those are the sort of the things you got to navigate, but problematic to me means that if you're doing the work yourself, it's a problem. If if the retirement plan has John Smith working in the business, then okay, I'm okay with that. Okay.
Okay, so what
But
you're saying
generally,
is,
that's what not people doing.
so what you're saying is, with respect to a Roth IRA or whatever, wholesaling is a prohibited transaction.
Generally speaking. Okay.
What do you mean,
Now,
generally speaking? It's yes or no?
no, it's not yes or no, because I could sit there and I could buy a piece of property. Okay. And maybe my intent is to rent it. And then I end up assigning the contract to somebody else. That's a wholesale, right? And that's not prohibited because my initial intent was not to wholesale. My initial intent was to buy it and rent it.
So
Okay?
it boils down to intent and how that transaction
Everything,
falls.
right? Everything boils down to intent, right?
Yeah, well, that leaves a gray area, does it not?
Well, that's why I use words like generally speaking and those sorts of things because I'm not you. I don't know what's between your ears and what you're contemplating. Okay?
Right. Well, part of what I was thinking was that you need to have some sort of a LLC drafted up that provides the overall rules about how you're transacting business with this Roth IRA and when a wholesaling might occur.
Yeah. I'll buy that. I know, I know a number of people that it's not I don't know that you necessarily, there's certain things that LLCs are good for. Okay. I would argue rehabbing is a good reason to have a checkbook LLC because there's a lot of moving parts, right? You got to pay the stone guy, the carpenter, the this guy, the that guy, the other guy. Okay. And it is much easier to do. And most of those guys want to be paid when they finish the work, not, they don't want to wait a week or whatever. Okay. So I would argue that's a good reason to have a checkbook IRA. If you are making loans, for instance, I think the LLC is duplicitous. I don't think it does. I don't think it gets you anything. And in certain areas, so for instance, if you're in Maryland, it costs you $300 a year to maintain that LLC. Okay. And it's a cost maybe you don't need. Secondarily, the other thing with LLCs, and the day is coming soon where the custodian is going to require a financial statement from you. Okay. And that financial statement is obviously a balance sheet and a P&L. I would venture to guess, and I have nothing to support this. This is purely anecdotal. Okay. But I would venture, based on what I see for the LLC people, most of our clients, I get like an Excel document. Okay. And part of this is my CPA brain going a little nuts, right? And I know that they're not maintaining a set of books the way they should maintain a set of books. They're not running it like a business. Okay. They're running it by checkbook is all they're doing. And once a year when Mid-Atlantic says, hey, we need a fair market value, then it's like, oh my God, I got to go do this and that and the other thing. Okay. So you're better off doing that stuff proactively, as it comes up, and maintaining a full set of books, because the day is coming, where the custodian is going to say, you got to provide an accounting at the end of the year. Okay. And I mean, if you talk to all custodians, they sit there and they tell you that you have to do that, right? But none of them are going to, for instance, close your account because you give them a financial statement that doesn't look like it came out of QuickBooks or from a bookkeeper or something along those lines. Okay.
Very good. Well, thank you for your comments.
Yeah, no problem. The other thing I would say about wholesaling too is that wholesaling, as I said before, wholesaling is a business activity. Okay, so it's subject to UBIT, unrelated business income tax. Okay, so there might be another nuance there. Okay.
Thank you.
You bet. Anybody else? Anything else?
That's an interesting discussion, Jack. So how is wholesaling? So I buy properties from wholesalers. Okay. And so they take their pound of flesh off. Then they sell it to me at a below market rate. Then I might put, some work into it. Obviously, I don't touch the property. I buy these things sight unseen. And then I turn around, and my intent is to rent it, but I might turn around and, on a flip, I'll just sell it. But let's say I buy a property and we get into it and go, gosh, this needs more work than I thought. I'm just going to unload this thing. How am I and I might have come by it not through a wholesaler per se, but I might have come across it myself. And then I turn around and go, I don't want this thing. I'm going to go sell it. I guess it goes back to intent, right?
No, actually, in a wholesale, okay, I'm not buying the property, right? I'm just getting a property under contract, and then I'm sloughing that off on somebody else. You're actually buying the property. The property actually is deeded to your IRA. That doesn't happen in wholesaling.
Right.
Okay. And that's the difference. Although you might end up in the same place as the wholesaler, but you were at risk because you actually bought the property.
Right.
Okay. Then, and based on what you said, you actually put some money into it. that almost puts you as a rehabber as opposed to a wholesale. But by actually going through a closing process and settling on the property, and now you have it in either the name of an LLC, which is owned by the IRA, or in the name of your retirement plan, you've purchased, you've invested. And that's the difference.
Since you mentioned LLCs, in doing flips, and I know I've asked you this before, sometimes you just have to hit me on the head with a hammer several times before it gets through, but it would seem that having an LLC would shield my retirement account. Let's say I have a contractor that falls off a ladder. I got a problem. Now I have insurance, but and hopefully I have a contractor that's not a klutz, but let's say, say he does. Would having an LLC protect my retirement account from claims by that contractor or his subs that exceed the amount of insurance I have?
Well, yeah, in short, I mean, basically the only thing that's available to them, assuming that you're running the LLC the way it should be run, okay? Assuming that you're doing that, then yeah, I mean, there's the only thing that a plaintiff could grab would be what's ever in the LLC, and I'll take that one step further, and people will, this is another thing that I have some vigorous debates on. I would suggest that if I'm a rehabber and I go that route, at the end of the rehab, I close that LLC.
Exactly.
And then the next rehab, I start a new LLC. And the reason I'm doing that is I don't want an issue from 2 or 3 properties back to impact all the money I've made on the next 2 deals. Okay. So, I mean, I see this kind of thing all the time where somebody rehabs a property, they sell it, the buyer comes in, they're living there for a while, and pipes burst. Okay. And as it turns out, somebody did faulty work, right? If that LLC is still alive, then it's still open for suit. Okay. And typically, what that person is going to do is they're either going to go see if you're still in business, okay? Or if they're really pissed off enough, they'll hire a lawyer to see if you're still in business. And if the thing is closed, generally the issue dies right there because there's nothing to go chase, right? But if the entity is still up and running, it's it still can be a party to a suit.
So if I just closed on a property today and I just got the recording receipt, so now I own it, or my IRA and my 401k partnered on it, it sounds like it would be worth my while to spend a few bucks, have it retitled in the name of an LLC, and go from there. I guess I'd have to redo my insurance and a couple of other things.
Yeah.
That's a minor.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of that depends on, what your prospect is for this property. Okay. If you're going to, if you're going to rehab it and sell it within a year,
I am.
I might just kind of gut through this one, but the next one, I would think about that. Okay.
I'll do that. Now this is going to be a 30-day rehab. We're going to get it done in 30 days and we'll be out of it.
Your lips to God's ears, man.
I know.
I'll say this too, what people will do too is they'll silo within their accounts. So they might, so remember I said a retirement plan is a trust. Okay. So effectively it's like an LLC, right? If a trust gets sued, you can only reach what's in the trust. You can't reach the beneficiaries of the trust or the beneficial owner. So, we have a lot of clients too that what they'll do is they'll do that. And this is particularly true in like California, New York. And these are states where the fee to have an LLC, in California, it's $1,000 a year. Okay. So you think, you think long and hard about setting up an LLC. Virginia, what's it, $50? You know, whatever, it's cheap. Maryland at $300 is sort of, halfway to expensive, but not quite there. New York is $500. So in jurisdictions where it's really expensive, what people will do is they'll do their rehab. They'll do the only asset in the account will be that rehab. If they've got other assets, they hold those in other IRAs. Okay. So, I've got one client that does that with rental properties, and I think he's got at least 10 or 12 different IRAs. Okay. Doesn't cost him any more money as far as we're concerned. Okay. But he does that because he's got each property in a separate one. So if he's got a problem at property one, it doesn't bleed into 2, 3, or 4. Okay. So conceptually, though, it's the same thing, right? You're siloing.
Yeah, that makes good sense. That's smart.
All right. So, we've been going at this for a while. I appreciate everybody's time. This is the kind of thing we do on our client calls. So, if you think about it and you're around, come back to us in 2 weeks. we can kick around a lot more of these things. So, but as always, I appreciate your time. If you've got questions, don't hesitate to reach out. And our door is always open. Team's always ready to talk to you. If you want a deeper discussion, as I said before, clients, we have that strategy call in a couple of weeks and focus more on execution, timelines, planning, those sorts of things. To anybody who's new to this, if you want a little more information, we have webinars on the website. Don't hesitate to grab those, look at them at your leisure. You know, it's a good starting point for understanding self-directed accounts. And then, feel free to give us a call or email us at hello@. So again, I appreciate everybody's time. It was a great discussion tonight. I appreciate that. And I hope to see you guys all soon. Take care.